The glass hit the floor before anyone could stop it. And in that split second, the most powerful man in the room forgot how to breathe. Because walking through those doors, the doors of the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, was the woman he had left broken, penniless, and pregnant, on the floor of a queen's apartment with an eviction notice in her hand. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was glowing. And the man standing beside her protective hand at her back was the one billionaire in New York that Derek Voss had always been quietly, deeply afraid of. Every whisper in that room died. Every eye locked onto her. And Derek Voss, the man who told her she was never built for this life, watched his entire empire begin to crack from a single look. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. This is the story of a woman who had everything taken from her: her money, her home, her dignity, her unborn child's future, and still found a way to make the man who broke her kneel. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the most power. It's the one who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they could erase you, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment where someone finally saw your worth? I want to hear it.
That single, shattering sound was the price of his cruelty finally coming due. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to rewind 8 months to a betrayal designed to be absolute. Derek hadn't just ended their marriage. He'd tried to obliterate her existence. It started the night he walked into their home, past midnight, his new mistress, Leah Crane, clinging to his arm. Her lipstick was smudged, her laugh echoing with the sound of a battle. She believed she'd already won. He hadn't even bothered to look ashamed. "Elena," he'd said with a dismissive wave, "don't make a scene. Leah and I are together now." When she whispered that they were married, his voice was chilling. "For now," he'd corrected her. "Let's be real. We're from 2 different worlds. You're nice, but you were never built for this life." Her hands shook as she played her last card, the one she thought would save them. "I'm pregnant." Derek's face didn't soften. It hardened into something unrecognizable. He stepped close, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "Then you'll handle it yourself. I can't have a kid ruining my public image." The next morning, she came home to find her life packed into cardboard boxes. He had frozen their accounts, blocked her number, and canceled their lease. He left her with nothing except the faint heartbeat of the life growing inside her. For months after, she survived in a forgotten corner of Queens, living in a run-down apartment, eating cheap noodles, and crying into her pillow at night. She thought her story was over, a cautionary tale of a discarded wife. She didn't know that fate was already arranging her rescue, guiding her toward the one man Derek truly feared. She had no idea Adrian Cole was about to change everything. Her apartment in Queens was little more than a box with peeling paint and a window that rattled in the wind. Unit 4C on the 4th floor was a lonely place, where the hiss of the radiator was her only company. Morning sickness was a brutal daily ritual over a cracked bathroom sink. The walk to her temp job at a finance office felt longer each week as she clutched her coat tightly, hiding a pregnancy that now felt like a secret shame. But the loneliness was nothing compared to the rumors. Derek's PR team worked fast, painting her as a manipulative gold digger who trapped him. Old friends looked away and coworkers whispered behind her back. She learned to eat lunch alone, to ignore the pitying glances, and to disappear into bathroom stalls for a few precious minutes to silently weep. She was isolated, just as he planned. She spent her nights with a hand over her stomach, promising the little life inside that she was trying her best. But promises couldn't pay the rent. One evening, exhausted from a long shift, she found a bright yellow eviction notice taped to her door. The paper trembled in her hand as she sank to the floor, a single broken sob escaping her lips. At that exact moment of utter despair, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Miss Foster," a calm, deep voice said, "my name is Adrian Cole. I believe you need help." She froze, the name echoing in the silent room. Before she could speak, he continued, "I'm outside your building. Please open the door." And in that moment, her life split into a before and an after. All of this, the pain, the betrayal, and the eventual rescue, happened because once she had loved a struggling entrepreneur with everything she had. She was the anchor who supported his dreams when no one else would. Ah, so that's how it was. With his hands clasped and his voice a low, steady hum, he said, "Our meeting was no accident." A chill shot through her. "What do you mean?" Adrian clarified, "I didn't know you, not personally, but I was aware of you long before that evening in Queens." A cold sense of dread began to crawl up her neck. "How?" she managed to ask. At last, Adrian laid out the whole truth. "Derek and I were more than competitors. We were partners 5 years back on a huge development project. I put my faith in him, and he stabbed me in the back." Elena gasped for air as Adrian went on. "He forged papers, moved money around, and tanked a deal that cost my company a fortune. He got away with it by pinning it all on a junior analyst from my staff, a decent man whose career was ruined." Her chest felt tight. "So this was all for revenge?" "No," Adrian said, moving a step nearer. "This was for accountability." But Derek hid behind a wall of attorneys and non-disclosure agreements. I had no legal way to reach him. Not unless I found someone who understood his methods. Someone he'd never see coming. Her pulse hammered in her ears. It was a reckoning that had been a long time coming for Derek Voss, a man who prided himself on never being caught off guard. His empire was built by outthinking rivals, seeing market shifts early and crushing anyone in his path. But since that evening at the Aurelius, when he saw Elena walk in with Adrian Cole, a crack had appeared in his foundation. He tried to brush it off with his usual arrogance to convince himself she was the same weak woman he had discarded. But the sight of her, poised and confident next to Adrian, played over and over in his head. Worse, others had seen it too. Investors were murmuring. Board members were trading looks. Even his own employees were avoiding his gaze. For the first time in a very long time, Derek felt a sliver of fear. Leah Crane, draped over his penthouse sofa, was scrolling her phone with a dramatic sigh. The gossip blogs are having a field day with this. Ex-wife shines, while billionaire's new flame looks tacky. Ugh, such poor taste. Derek's temper flared. What was she doing there? A place like that is not for her. Leah arched an eyebrow. Perhaps it is now. He gave her a withering glare, but even Leah, who relished belittling Elena, had seen the way Adrian stood by her side that night. He was attentive, assured, a shield. That kind of alliance wasn't formed by chance. "Maybe he's just using her," Leah offered, setting her phone down. "A man like that isn't in the business of charity." Derek scoffed. "Elena, please. She can't even manage a simple budget. He has no use for her." "Then why was he with her?" Leah pushed. Derek had no answer because he didn't have one. None of it added up. But it had all started with a single, terrifying step onto Park Avenue, where the tower scraped the gray winter clouds. Elena stood frozen before the revolving doors, nervously pulling at her worn sleeves, while polished black town cars purred past. The sheer wealth surrounding her felt like a different world, inhabited by people in fine coats and leather briefcases who moved like they owned the pavement beneath their feet. She felt like an imposter. The gleam of the marble floors inside was blinding. Uniformed guards gave polite nods, and receptionists offered practiced smiles. But as Elena moved toward the elevator bank, her stomach clenched. A massive digital ticker was scrolling the day's financial headlines. And there he was, Derek Voss, founder of Voss Tech, set to announce a major expansion. His confident, smug face stared out from the screen. Beside him was a smaller photo of Leah Crane, with a caption celebrating her as the PR director behind the company's new vision. Elena's throat constricted as she fought back a wave of emotion. "Miss Foster!" She spun around. Adrienne was there, dressed in a flawless dark suit, but his sharp eyes softened as he took in her distress. "You made it," he said softly. She could only nod. "I almost left." "I'm very glad you didn't," he replied, guiding her toward a private elevator. As the doors closed, sealing them in silence, he spoke again. "I realize coming here is intimidating, but you possess something incredibly valuable." She shook her head. "I have nothing left." "You're mistaken," he said, meeting her gaze. "You have the truth. And the truth is the one thing a man like Derek can't control." That resolve, however, had been hard-won. The morning before, she had sat on her thin mattress, staring at the business card. Adrian Cole, Cole and Hawthorne Capital. The embossed print itself felt heavy, a symbol of a life she couldn't fathom. Sleep had been fleeting, her mind replaying his sudden appearance, his calm demeanor, the way he stood in her doorway like a harbinger. It all felt like a dream. Powerful men didn't just appear in the rundown queen's walk-ups of discarded women. They didn't see someone abandoned and pregnant and offer to help. A knock had made her jump, but it was only her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Calderon, from 4B, with a small paper bag. "Breakfast," the woman said kindly. "You're stronger than you think, mija." After her neighbor left, Elena had looked at her reflection, a tired, pregnant woman just trying to hold it together, but his words echoed in her mind. "I can help you rebuild everything." It was an impossible promise. But then, so was everything else that had happened to her. Just before noon, she had made up her mind, and it all began with the knock. He was the man whose decisions rattled boardrooms, a name whispered with reverence and fear. He was on her phone. Elena's hand trembled. I think you've got the wrong number." "No," his voice came back, surprisingly gentle. "I am precisely where I mean to be." A shiver went down her spine. "How do you even know who I am?" she whispered. There was a brief, weighted silence on the other end. "Because," he answered finally, "I saw what was done to you, and I do not let injustice stand." Before she could process that, he added, "Please open your door, Elena." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Stumbling to her feet, she leaned on the wall for support, the weight of the pregnancy a constant, heavy pressure. She quickly wiped at her tear-stained face, though the gesture felt absurd. She fumbled with the 2 locks on her door and pulled it open. Cold December air rushed in, and with it, a tall man in a charcoal coat, snowflakes dusting his dark hair. Couldn't see. The color drained from Derek's face as Elena placed a small flash drive on the polished boardroom table. Her hand was steady. "These are voice recordings," she announced, her voice clear and calm. "They are conversations between Derek and myself from when he pressured me to sign those documents." The air in the room grew thick. "He assured me it was all routine," she continued. "He told me not to worry my pretty little head about it. He said my signature was just a formality." Derek looked like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. The final checkmate wasn't a complex financial maneuver. It was the simple, undeniable truth, spoken in a voice he had once worked so hard to silence. Friendly was dangerous, but a woman with nothing left to lose was lethal. It hadn't come to this overnight. The seeds of his destruction were planted the moment Adrian's voice dropped to a deadly calm. "She has proof," he'd stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Back then, Elena had still been shaking, her breath catching as she pulled out that same flash drive. She had looked at the powerful board members, men who saw the world in profits and losses, and decided to bet on herself. "I didn't know what I was signing," she'd explained, her voice gaining strength with every word. "Derek told me it was harmless, that the business side of things was too complicated for me to understand." A skeptical murmur had rippled through the room until the chairman held up a file, pointing to the signatures that moved millions into private accounts. "No," Elena had said, her voice ringing with conviction. "I had no knowledge of any illegal activity. Derek misled me." And that deception was his biggest mistake. It was the reason Lila Crane, a woman who built her life on curated envy and weaponized smiles, had seen an opportunity. Lila had always understood the cheaper, shinier version of power. So when a grainy photo of Elena and Adrian appeared online, she felt threatened. She sat in Derek's sterile penthouse kitchen, the winter sun glinting off the marble, scrolling through comments that declared Elena had leveled up. Her manicured fingers tightened on her phone. "What is this?" she snapped as Derek entered. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tight. "Noise," he muttered. "Noise?" Her voice rose. "Your ex-wife looks like she just stepped out of a Vogue spread with Adrian Cole. People are writing narratives, Derek. Narratives where you are the disposable one." The word disposable stung him. "I don't care about Adrian," Derek insisted, but the slight flinch told Lila everything she needed to know. Fear in a powerful man was a delicacy. "They're calling Elena the sympathetic one," she added, twisting the knife. He spat Elena's name like venom. "She knows nothing about this world." Lila's smile sharpened. "Good. Then she won't know how to survive what's coming." She saw his hesitation and pressed her advantage. "Don't get soft now," she said coolly. "She isn't your wife anymore. She's a liability." His silence was all the permission she needed to control the narrative, to destroy Elena before she ever became a problem. He didn't realize he was handing his enemy the very weapon she would use against him. His permission unleashed a storm. That afternoon, Lila's fingers flew across her keyboard, crafting rumors and anonymous tips. The story spread like wildfire. Manipulative ex-wife, revenge plot, using an unborn child for wealth. She dug up an old photo of Elena crying outside a subway station on a day she'd fainted from exhaustion and sold it to a tabloid, inventing a story of emotional instability. Within hours, social media turned into a cesspool of cruelty. Elena saw it all at once. She was in Adrian's office, reviewing spreadsheets, when her phone began buzzing itself off the table. Her stomach tightened as she clicked a notification. Her heart dropped. The accusations and lies were so sharp, so personal, they stole her breath. Her hands trembled. Adrian noticed immediately. "Elena?" he asked quietly. She couldn't speak. She just turned her phone toward him. His expression didn't change at first, but then his eyes darkened with a cold, dangerous fury she had never seen before. "This wasn't Derek," Adrian stated. "This is her. Lila," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "Yes," he said, standing slowly, every movement lethal. "And she just crossed a line she will regret." Elena swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" He looked at her, not with pity, but with a firm promise. "Now," he said, his voice like chipped ice, "we stop letting them choose the battlefield." That was the moment the game truly changed. The war had officially begun. But before the war, there was just the quiet unease of a dawning threat. It began in a boardroom, but a different one One where Elena had felt small and out of place, the Manhattan skyline looming behind her like a monument to an ambition she didn't share. The men in designer suits had stared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and calculation. "Is this the consultant you mentioned?" one had asked Adrian. Consultant. The word felt foreign, a costume she was wearing, but Adrian stood beside her, a steadying presence. "Yes," he replied simply. "This is Elena Foster." Her pulse hammered against her ribs, loud enough for the whole city to hear. "I know what you're thinking," Adrian had told the room, and her. "She's not a Wall Street insider, but I trust her analysis and her perspective." The words stunned her. He trusted her enough to bring her here. He gently touched her elbow. "Have a seat," he said. As the meeting began, she listened silently, terrified of breathing too loudly. Then Adrian pulled up a series of financial charts showing anomalies inside Vostek's contracts, irregularities she recognized. Her own name had been on some of them, signed back when Derek had forced her to, telling her she wouldn't understand. "Miss Foster," an executive had asked, "do these patterns look familiar?" Her blood ran cold. Adrian gave her a reassuring look, but Elena lifted her chin. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. "I've seen these numbers before." She explained the manipulated expenses, the pressure from Derek, the way he always dismissed her with a casual, "Leave the business to me, Elena." Her cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with a slow-burning anger. An executive leaned forward. "Miss Foster, you realize you're describing what could be a major corporate fraud, right?" She did. It was the beginning of her understanding. Her throat was tight. "I'm not trying to cause a scene. I'm just being honest." Adrian's tone was level but sharp. "Honesty can be a scene." Another executive chimed in. "Why use your name, though?" Elena let out a breath. "Because he assumed I was a nobody, insignificant, someone no one would ever listen to." A heavy silence fell over the room. That's when Adrian, who had been listening intently, spoke with deliberate force. Her insignificance was his entire strategy, but he miscalculated. A nervous energy filled the room, but Adrian wasn't finished. "From now on," he declared, "Elena's analysis is core to our plan. Anyone who dismisses her does so at their own peril." Elena's chest seized. "Core?" An executive arched a brow. "You're putting her on the team?" Adrian's nod was firm, effective immediately. Her eyes welled up, not with fear, but with an unfamiliar feeling. Power. She had no idea what was coming. She didn't know Derek's next move. She had no clue if she could handle any of it. But looking over the Manhattan skyline, a hand instinctively covering her stomach, one thing was clear. For the first time since Derek had shattered her world, she wasn't fighting by herself anymore. In the 2 days after that boardroom meeting, Elena's world began to quietly realign. It wasn't loud or sudden. There were no grand pronouncements, just a subtle, powerful shift in perception. People saw her in a new light. Their conversations with her changed, all because Adrian Cole had granted her what Derek had denied: recognition. Cole and Hawthorne Capital sent a quiet internal email naming Elena Foster a temporary financial advisor for a sensitive audit. Her name appeared right alongside senior staff. And while the news wasn't for public consumption in the glass towers of New York, secrets have a short shelf life. By midday, the whispers started. "Is that really her? The one Adrian is working with? She's the one Voss ruined, isn't she? I heard she found something big, something that would interest the feds." Each elevator trip was a test of her nerve. Every look carried weight. Some were curious, others admiring, a few were skeptical. But for the first time in what felt like forever, none of them were filled with pity. The pressure, however, was immense. She was pregnant, worn out, and a stranger to this world of polite backstabbing. She felt completely out of place, yet she felt more at home among these predators than she ever did hidden behind Derrick. That afternoon, Adrian asked her to a private investor luncheon at the Regent Club, an establishment so exclusive you needed an invitation just to breathe its air. Elena felt a wave of panic. "I can't go in there," she whispered. "Those people are on magazine covers, corporate boards, and government. I'm nobody." "You're Elena," Adrienne interrupted, "and that is more than enough." But she just shook her head. "I have nothing appropriate to wear." A faint smile touched Adrienne's lips. "That problem is easily solved." Before she could protest, his assistant presented 2 elegant garment bags and some low heels. They were tasteful, simple, and clearly picked for a woman who was expecting. Elena's voice was strained. "I can't take these. This isn't a gift," Adrienne said gently. "It's your uniform for the role you've earned." Stepping into the Regent Club was like walking into a vault of old New York money. Gilded lamps, classic oil paintings, and dark wood walls created a space where empires were made and broken over drinks. When Elena walked in with Adrian, a subtle quiet fell over the room. People sat up a little straighter, their eyes widening just a fraction, because it wasn't just any woman Adrienne Cole had brought, it was this specific woman. A man at the far end of the table, silver-haired and authoritative, rose to meet them. "Adrienne, we weren't expecting you." "I know," Adrienne said smoothly. "This is Elena Foster. She's consulting for us." The man's eyes darted to her pregnant stomach and then back to her face, not with judgment, but with appraisal. "Miss Foster," he said, offering a hand, "I'm told you discovered an issue our own people overlooked." Elena felt her face grow hot. I'm not sure about that." "It's true," Adrian stated, his voice unwavering. The table's attention shifted to her completely. Questions began to fly, sharp and direct. "What was the pattern you identified? How long do you suspect the discrepancies have been going on? Why did Vostek's own team fail to see it?" Elena's voice trembled at first, but then her mind, quick, sharp, and more resilient than she knew, took the lead. She laid out the doctored figures, the altered reports, and the suspicious movement of assets. She just told them what she knew, and her knowledge commanded the room. When she was done, the silver-haired man let out an impressed breath. "Miss Foster, you may have just exposed what could be the largest corporate fraud in 3 years." Elena stared, stunned. Fraud? Involving Derrick? A quiet buzz filled the room. Adrian leaned in, his voice for her ears only. "This is precisely why you had to be here." She swallowed, her mouth dry. "Does Derrick know?" "Not yet," Adrian replied, his gaze like steel. "But when he finds out, his entire empire will begin to crumble." A shaky breath escaped Elena as it all clicked into place. For the first time since Derrick tried to erase her, she was no longer the prey. She was becoming the predator. Derrick Voss operated under the assumption that he was untouchable. But over the last 48 hours, the ground had begun to shift beneath him. It started small, then became obvious. His calls weren't being returned. His emails received clipped, formal replies. Meetings he once dominated were now thick with tension. He was being watched. People were talking, and rooms would go strangely quiet when he entered, a silence that felt like the calm before a hurricane. He dismissed it as stress until his CFO, Grant Melville, burst into his office unannounced. "We've got a major issue," Grant said, his voice tight. Derrick didn't bother to look up from his computer. "Grant, if the building isn't burning down, it can wait." "This is worse." That got Derrick's attention. Grant tossed a file onto his desk. Cole and Hawthorne Capital are acquiring stakes in two of our key partners. It's quiet, but it's aggressive. Derek just looked at him. And, Grant almost yelled. And Adrian Cole only makes a move like this when he's planning a takedown. The words hit Derek hard. But Grant had more. The board is aware. They're starting to ask some very pointed questions. Derek's heart pounded. Adrian. It all came back to Adrian, and by extension, to Elena. His jaw clenched. What did she say to him? Derek snarled. What garbage is she feeding him? Grant paused. I don't think it's garbage. Derek slammed his fist on the table. She knows nothing. Grant shrank back. She did sign the paperwork, he said softly. Derek's blood turned to ice. She was my wife, he shot back. I told her where to sign. It's not like she understood any of it. Grant's voice dropped. Legally, that might not be a defense. A thick, suffocating quiet filled the office. Then Grant delivered the final blow. Derek, if she goes to the SEEC, it's over for you. That night, Derek paced his penthouse, which now felt less like a home and more like a prison. He called Leia repeatedly. No answer. On the 10th try, she finally picked up, annoyed. What is it? What's going on? Derek barked. Why is Cole targeting me? What did you do? Leia laughed coldly. You're the one who left his pregnant ex-wife broke and humiliated. Did you honestly believe she would just vanish? She's not smart enough for this, Derek insisted. Someone else is pulling the strings. Leia's tone became frigid. Perhaps if you'd shown her some respect instead of trying to destroy her. Derek was floored. It was the first time Leia had ever defended Elena. He didn't like it one bit. Whose side are you on? He demanded. Leia's hesitation was a death sentence. I'm on the winning side, she said, and hung up the phone. Derek's hand shook. His mistress was gone. His company was under siege, and Elena, the woman he thought he had crushed, was coming for him. The following morning, Derek strode into the Vostek boardroom, ready to take back command, but he felt the change as soon as he walked in. 12 board members stared back at him. Their faces were cold, unreadable, and sharp. Derek, the chairman began, we need to talk about the audit. Derek went rigid. What audit? A folder slid down the polished table. The words on the cover were a death blow. Cole and Hawthorne, preliminary findings, Vostek, anomalies. His head spun. Adrienne was already moving against him. We expect your full cooperation, the chairman said, and your honesty. Derek's throat closed up. You think I'm hiding something? We think, the chairman said, with careful precision, that your ex-wife possesses information we are now required to examine. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Elena. Derek breathed, completely shocked. He had ruined her. He had erased her. He expected her to disappear. Instead, she was the one person the board now wanted to hear from. He was losing his power, his company, his entire manufactured world. Derek Voss had finally encountered a force he could not control, and her name was Elena Foster. And all of it began the evening Adrian Cole appeared at her apartment door. She never expected him to be there, and she certainly never expected to see an expression on his face that was a raw, shocking mix of protectiveness and a barely contained rage. Are you all right? He asked her. The word hung in the air, cold and dismissive. Sweetheart. Elena met his gaze across the boardroom table, a flicker of the old fear extinguished by a new, steady flame. Don't call me that. Her voice was quiet, but carried across the silent room. You lost that right. Turning to the chairman, she drew a calm breath. You asked for me. I'm here to explain the financial activities you're concerned about. Activities I was tricked into signing off on. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Derek's face paled, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the timid wife he'd discarded. He was looking at a woman who held his entire future in her hands. She had him, and he knew it. But that composure hadn't come easily. It was earned just an hour before as she walked through the gleaming Vostek lobby, a place that once made her feel small. Today was different. With Adrienne Cole by her side and her hand resting on her belly, she felt grounded. She wasn't the frightened woman who used to bring Derek his lunch, hoping to go unnoticed. The receptionist's shocked face confirmed the rumors had spread, but the woman they were expecting, the broken, hysterical ex-wife, wasn't the one who stepped out of the elevator. When the doors opened to the silent executive floor, every eye fell on her. She saw Derek pacing, a caged animal, and met his panicked stare without flinching. This wasn't an ambush, it was a reckoning. Her readiness was cemented by a single, sharp knock on Adrienne's office door. His assistant had entered, her face grim, holding a tablet. On the screen was a leaked internal memo from Vostek, formally summoning Elena Foster before the board. An official demand, a power play. "They're trying to corner you," Adrienne had said, his voice hard as steel. Elena stared at the screen, her heart hammering, not with fear, but with a sudden, shocking clarity. A pulse of adrenaline shot through her. "No," she whispered, looking up at him. "They're trying to break me." In that moment, something shifted inside her for good. The time for running was over. She was finally ready to fight back. That fight began when Adrienne knelt beside her chair, not as a CEO, but as a man seeing the truth of her strength. "Listen to me," he'd said, his voice low and firm. "You survived the worst of him long before I showed up. You endured things that would break most people." He saw the tears welling in her eyes and shook his head slightly. "You are not weak, Elena. You were isolated. You were manipulated, but you were never weak." His words were a lifeline, pulling her out of the fog of self-doubt Derek had shrouded her in for years. "This time," he added, his gaze unwavering, "you're walking into that battle with someone at your back." She wiped her eyes, a single decisive nod her only reply. "Okay," she breathed. "Let's do it." The strategy was simple: fight their lies with the unshakable truth. Adrienne laid out their plan on the polished walnut of his desk. "They think the easiest way to protect themselves is to ruin your credibility," he explained, pointing to a timeline of every fraudulent transfer. Each one was a nail Derek had intended for her coffin. "All of this has your signature on it," Adrienne stated, his voice devoid of pity, only resolve. "Which is why our next move must be precise. We can't let them control the story." She'd swallowed hard, the magnitude of it settling on her. He was right. The board would demand her testimony, and Derek would panic. They had to get ahead of him. They had to control how the truth came out. Before the plan, however, there was the attack that made it necessary. Adrienne hadn't brought her to his office for a strategy session at first. He'd brought her there to show her something. Shielding her from the world in his top-floor sanctuary, he slid a file across the table, his face grim. "Someone leaked to the press that you're involved in an SEC investigation." The headlines were brutal. "Derek Voss's ex-wife named in financial scrutiny. Pregnancy used for sympathy." The words were designed to paint her as a liar, a manipulator. "Leia did this," she'd whispered, the metallic taste of betrayal filling her mouth. "Yes," Adrienne confirmed, "and Derek let her, because they need you to be the villain." But her resolve to fight back wasn't born in his office. It was forged in the fire of righteous anger in her own small kitchen. It happened the moment she understood Derek's full cruelty. He hadn't just thrown her out. He'd left behind a hidden landmine, set to detonate if she ever dared to speak up. "He wanted to ruin me," she whispered, her fear twisting into a pure, searing rage. "He took everything and still wanted a way to destroy me." Adrian had nodded slowly. "But he failed, because you're not alone now." He looked at her, his gaze steady and clear. "And we control the truth, not him." In that instant, her tears stopped. Her hands grew steady. The victim was gone. "What do we do now?" she asked. That anger was ignited by a truth so dark it felt like her chest was splitting open. "There's more," Adrian had said gently, after revealing the initial fraud. Crouching beside her, his voice low, he delivered the final blow. "We also discovered Derek kept copies of those documents. He didn't destroy them." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "He wanted leverage," Adrian explained. "If you ever became a threat to his image, he could have had you arrested." The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. He, the man who claimed to love her, had prepared a cage for her, ready to lock her away forever if she ever fought back. And it all began with a folder laid on her kitchen table. Those signatures, Adrienne had explained, his voice calm and measured, tied you to transactions you knew nothing about. He pointed to a line item. They were used to approve transfers into private accounts Derek created. Her mind froze. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice a bare whisper. "It means Derek was laundering money," Adrian said carefully, "and legally your signature approved it." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. "If the SEC had found this first," he continued, "you would have gone to prison." The word struck her with physical force. She pressed a hand to her belly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Prison. He had risked everything for her. It started with a knock on her apartment door. When she opened it, Adrian Cole was standing there, his expression serious. "Elena," he said, stepping inside. "Something came up today. Something you need to know before you hear it from anyone else." The tension coming off him was a stark warning. He held a single folder in his hand. "We found something in the documents you signed for Derek a long time ago," he said, his voice steady but dark. "Something he hid from you." She felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "What is it?" she asked. He placed the folder on her table. "It's something," he said, meeting her eyes, "that was designed to ruin your life." And just like that, her whole world began to unravel. And it all started because Derek couldn't see what was right in front of him. Blinded by arrogance, he'd stormed into his office, pulling up reports. Numbers usually soothed him, but not that day. One name kept appearing where it shouldn't. Adrian Cole. His firm was quietly buying shares in companies tied to VSTEC. "What is he planning?" Derek muttered. Then his assistant buzzed. A reporter wanted a comment on a restaurant incident. Another call. Mr. Varelli from the board mentioned Adrian Cole was seen meeting with 2 senior investors. Derek shot up. "They said it looked friendly," his assistant added. Friendly. Friendly was alliances. Friendly was influence. And as his pulse thundered, all Derek could think was, Elena can't be a part of this. She's not capable of it. So that's how it was. He never even saw her coming. The recording ended, plunging the boardroom into a heavy silence. Derek Voss, a man accustomed to command, stood frozen as his own condescending voice echoed in the air. "Just sign it, Elena. It's fine." The chairman turned slowly, his gaze cold. "Mr. Voss, do you have an explanation?" Derek's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. It was then, seeing the raw fear in his eyes, that Elena finally saw him clearly, a coward, terrified of the woman he'd dismissed as powerless. She felt a new strength rise within her. "I'm done being used," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Adrian Durant's look was one of pure pride. The power in the room had irrevocably shifted. Elena was no longer the victim. She was the witness who could dismantle an entire empire. The moment the audio stopped playing, the atmosphere cracked. Power silently rearranged itself around the polished table. Derek Voss, who always moved as if he owned the very air in the room, suddenly looked small and pale. The chairman shut the file. "Miss Foster, thank you. This is invaluable." Derek snapped to attention. "Proceed with what? You're believing her? My unstable ex-wife?" "Stop!" The chairman's voice was sharp. "We've heard enough." The words were a final verdict. Derek glared at Elena, his face contorted with rage. "You have no idea what you've just done." Elena met his gaze, without flinching. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." Just then the door swung open, and two officials from the SEC walked in. A wave of shock hit the room. Even Adrian seemed momentarily surprised. "Mr. Voss," one of the agents began, "we have some questions about financial irregularities at Vostek." Derek stammered, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. The agent handed him an official notice. "This isn't an arrest, but your immediate cooperation is required." The humiliation was a physical blow. The board members exchanged glances that were cold, clinical, and unified. This was no longer a domestic dispute, but a corporate crisis. The chairman folded his hands. "Mr. Voss, you're suspended from all decision-making duties, effective immediately." Silence, then an explosion of fury. "Suspended?" he bellowed. "Over her? She's nobody." Adrian rose to his feet, and the room went still. "I suggest you choose your next words with extreme care," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Derek's mouth snapped shut. Even through his blinding rage, Derek understood that Adrian Cole was a man whose power was silent, the kind you didn't have to raise your voice to prove. As the SEC officials urged Derek to come with them, he shot a final, venomous look at Elena. "You didn't do this on your own," he seethed. "He put you up to it." Elena's voice was unshakable. "No, Derek, you did this to yourself." For a brief moment, the facade of the billionaire visionary vanished, revealing a simple coward, terrified of being exposed. As the agents led him away, Elena let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, her hands trembling under the table. Adrienne placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You handled that perfectly," he murmured. She didn't feel like she had. Her heart was pounding. The world outside the boardroom was a blur of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The story was already breaking. Overwhelmed, Elena instinctively shielded her face until Adrian guided her through the crowd. "Just stay close," he said. But this time, the world wasn't pitying her. They saw a woman to be reckoned with. This was all the culmination of a storm that had been brewing for weeks, a storm that began with another woman's public downfall. And yet, this victory felt hollow because of a deeper secret, one Adrian had yet to share. It was a truth that would reframe everything. The chairman's words echoed in her mind. "Miss Foster, you are a crucial witness." But a witness to what, exactly? She was only now beginning to understand the scope of Derek's deceit. The architect of Derek's public image, Leah Crane, had always controlled the narrative. But now, the story was out of her hands, and the spotlight she craved was burning her. When news of Derek's suspension and the investigation broke, the media didn't just target him. They turned on the woman who had crafted his lies. Her phone became a torrent of accusations. Pacing Derek's penthouse, she watched the city lights mock her. This wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. It was the predictable outcome of a ruthless campaign she had launched against Elena weeks ago, a campaign designed to silence her forever. Leia had orchestrated online attacks, planted stories, and used her influence to paint Elena as a bitter, unstable ex-wife she had pushed, expecting Elena to break. On every news channel, Elena's face appeared not as a victim, but as the credible witness at the center of the Vostok scandal. Former wife exposes corporate fraud. Leia hurled her glass against the wall, shouting at the empty room, "How is she winning?" She knew the answer. Elena possessed a sincerity that Leia could only fake, and it was devastatingly effective. When Derek finally returned, his lawyer in tow, Leia confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me she had recordings? Why didn't you warn me about the SEC?" Derek brushed past her. "Not now, Leia." "Yes, now," she yelled. This had all started because Leia had convinced Derek that a preemptive strike against Elena was necessary, that they needed to discredit her before she could ever become a threat. "Everything is collapsing, and they think I helped you hide the money," she screamed. "You need to fix this." Derek turned on her, his eyes wild. "Fix it? You started this. You're the one who went after her, who stirred everything up and forced her to fight." Leia scoffed. "She was weak. I thought she'd shatter." "Well, she didn't." Derek's voice dropped. "And now she has Adrian Cole in her corner. You have no idea what you've done." Leia saw true fear in his eyes then, and it chilled her to the bone. The next morning, at her PR firm, she was summoned by the managing partners. This was it, she thought. They'd see she could spin this. But their faces told a different story. They looked at her like she was a liability that needed to be cut loose. "Your contract is terminated, effective immediately," the senior partner said. The words hit her like a physical blow. "You can't," she gasped. "We can," he retorted. "You brought this scandal to our doorstep." She tried to argue, to remind them of her value, but their minds were made up. As security escorted her from the building she built, a cold reality set in. She had lost. This was the crushing end to a battle she had started weeks prior, a battle where Adrian Cole quietly entered the fray, offering Elena the support and resources she needed, not just to survive, but to win. He had sought her out after seeing Leia's vicious online attacks, recognizing the patterns of a man he knew all too well. That help, however, came with a hidden history. Days before the board meeting, Adrian had called Elena to his private penthouse office, a space that felt designed for secrets. He stood facing the window, his posture rigid. "We need to talk," he said, and her stomach plummeted. "It wasn't about the investigation. It's about the truth," he admitted, finally turning to face her. The confident man she knew was gone, replaced by someone carrying an old, heavy burden. "I haven't told you everything about Derek," he began, his voice strained. "There's a reason I'm helping you. This entire takedown, this quest for justice, was never just about business. It was deeply personal. And it all began years ago with a simple, arrogant instruction from a husband to his wife. Just sign it, Elena. Don't ask questions. You wouldn't understand this stuff anyway." In that moment of casual dismissal, Elena felt a flicker of suspicion, a quiet instinct to protect herself. So she turned on her phone's recorder, capturing the very words that would one day bring his world crashing down. Model. His eyes, sharp and assessing, held an unexpected warmth. Adrian Cole, in person, standing on her crumbling doorstep. For a second, Elena forgot to breathe. His gaze took in the tiny, bleak apartment, the flickering light, the pile of bills, the lone mattress. But his expression held no pity, only a quiet, burning anger not aimed at her. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped back, a wave of shame washing over her. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "You've been through more than enough," he said, pulling off his gloves. "I'm not here to pass judgment." But she couldn't help it. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice breaking. "No one even calls me." Adrian looked at her, his expression softening. "Because you deserve justice for what was done to you. I know Derek Voss, and I know what men like him do to women they see as a threat." He held out a simple, elegant card. "If you can bring yourself to trust me," he said, "I can help you reclaim everything he tried to take away." And as her trembling fingers finally reached for it, she made a choice that would change everything. In a quiet ceremony, high above Manhattan, Elena finally found her peace. Standing beside Adrian at the Plaza Hotel, with her smiling toddler holding her hand, the city lights reflected a future she had built herself. There were no more scandals or lingering shadows, just healing and love. This was never about revenge. It was about her own rebirth. But that beautiful day was only possible because of a promise made on a quiet evening. After it was all over, Adrian had looked at her, his voice soft and sincere. "I'd like to build a life with you," he'd said. "Not as part of a strategy, but because I admire who you are." He saw her as strong, resilient, and capable all on her own. She had stopped him then, placing a hand on his chest. "I'm ready," she whispered, and his unguarded smile was everything. For the first time, she let herself dream of a joy that was truly earned, not borrowed. This new chapter could only begin because she had decisively closed the last one. That closure came on a crisp afternoon outside the Cole and Hawthorne building. Derek stood before her, no longer a polished billionaire, but a disheveled man, his eyes hollowed by panic. He begged her to talk, his voice cracking, but she remained perfectly calm and steady. "You ruined me," he'd whispered. Her response was soft but sharp. "Did you care when you forged my signature, when you tried to destroy me?" He flinched, admitting his mistakes. "No," she corrected him. "You made choices. You chose greed over loyalty, cruelty over love." For the first time in ages, Elena woke up without a crushing weight on her chest. Sunlight streamed into the guest room of the penthouse Adrienne had provided, a gentle, warm glow that felt like a pardon from life itself. Finally, she could breathe. She sat up, her hand instinctively cradling her stomach. "We're safe now," she whispered to the baby. "We're not by ourselves anymore." Her phone vibrated with a message from Adrienne. "Board's decision is out. Come to the office. It's a big day." A thrill, not of terror but of hope, ran through her. Everything was about to change. She selected her outfit with care. A simple navy dress Adrienne's aide had chosen weeks ago. It wasn't about glamour. It was about strength. The dress of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged with the truth as her shield. At the Cole and Hawthorne offices, the whispers had been replaced with nods of respect. The receptionist offered a genuine smile. A guard held the door open. "There she is," an analyst murmured. "Good morning, Ms. Foster," a senior partner said. It was a dizzying new reality, but for the first time it wasn't scary. Adrienne was waiting by his office window, the city sparkling behind him. "You're here," he said, his voice soft. "You told me to come," she answered with a faint smile. He seemed to relax at the sight of her, a tense knot in his shoulders loosening. "There's something you need to see." He passed her a folder. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It was the board's emergency resolution. Vostek was to be managed by a temporary committee, with Cole and Hawthorne Capital in charge. Her eyes shot up. "You're taking control?" "For a short time," Adrienne now clarified. "Just to right the ship and get rid of the rot." "And Derek?" His jaw clenched. "He's done. Legally, publicly, and financially, There's no coming back from this for him. There's more, he said, handing her another document. It was a consulting contract with a salary that was more than she'd earned in her entire life. And we have an empty penthouse in Midtown. It's safe, furnished, perfect for a mother and her baby. It's yours if you want it. Overwhelmed, she tried to refuse, but he stopped her. You earned this. You're not just recovering from what he did, Elena. You're building a new life. And so, as winter gave way to spring, her world was reborn. The new apartment wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary of sunlight and peace, a place where fear could no longer reach her. But this new dawn for Elena was only possible because of the dusk that had fallen on others. For Derek, the end came swiftly in the boardroom, his chest constricting as he grabbed a chair for support. "Where's Layla?" he demanded, desperately needing an ally. The board members just looked at each other. "She's not coming," Grant finally said. "Her firm let her go. She's gone dark and won't even talk to your lawyer." Derek swayed on his feet. No one was left in his corner. No mistress, no power, no one to believe him. Just the wreck of his legacy and the ghost of the woman he tried to destroy. When security came to remove him, he didn't fight. Layla Crane had always been a survivor, able to spin any scandal or charm any enemy. This time, however, her downfall was quiet, sharp, and brutally final. After being walked out of her own PR firm, she drifted through Midtown in a daze, the city's chill cutting right through her. The world rushed by, completely indifferent. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with furious clients and hungry reporters, but she couldn't answer. As evening fell, she found herself in a dingy cafe she would have sneered at just yesterday, staring into a cold cup of coffee. With trembling hands, she scrolled through the news feeds. It was a bloodbath. Every story she had planted against Elena had boomeranged back to her. Headlines now screamed her name, linking her directly to the scandal and claiming she orchestrated the attacks on Derek's ex-wife. Anonymous sources, she read. Of course, it was Derek. The coward had thrown her to the wolves, feeding the press just enough to paint her as the villain and save his own skin. "Well done," she whispered, the words tasting like acid. "Toss me aside to buy yourself another day." She was completely and utterly beaten. But as she kept reading, a colder truth settled in. The world wasn't buying Derek's story either. No one believed him, and no one believed her. Elena had become the hero, and Layla the villain. The hits kept coming. Her landlord called, politely telling her to be out by next week. "It's not about the rent, Miss Crane," he'd said gently. "It's the reputation. We can't have reporters camped out front." Then an email from her agent confirmed it. Every deal was canceled. Every client was gone. Her entire career had vanished overnight. Fueled by a cocktail of rage and desperation, she stormed to Derek's penthouse and hammered on the door until her knuckles were raw. "Derek, open this door!" But it wasn't Derek who answered. It was his lawyer, his expression like stone. "Mr. Voss isn't seeing anyone, Miss Crane." "I'm not just anyone," she shot back. "You are now someone with whom he has severed all ties," the lawyer stated flatly. The words hit her like a punch. "He wants me to just disappear?" "Yes, or," the lawyer confirmed. "He can't just do that. He already has." The door clicked shut, leaving her in the hallway, shaken, discarded, and alone. Just like Elena had been. In that moment, she knew. She had bet on the wrong man. And as the two of them fell from their thrones of power and deceit, the world finally understood the truth. The investigation had moved with breathtaking speed, all because of one thing. It all came back to the foundation of their ruin and her victory. The irrefutable evidence Elena had carefully gathered, piece by painful piece, through years of his quiet manipulation. His shoulders slumped, as he insisted he'd lost everything. Her final words landed with unshakable finality. "No, Derek. You lost it all because you tried to take everything from me." As he broke down, she knew he wasn't apologizing to her, but to the man he could have been. That chapter was now closed. His public downfall had been absolute. Derek Voss was formally charged with financial misconduct, his assets frozen. His name became a symbol of corporate greed. It was the result of a meticulously planned collapse he never saw coming, one that began not with a bang, but in a quiet boardroom. He had stormed into Vostek that morning, expecting to reclaim control, only to find chaos. The board informed him the SEC had probable cause, all based on anomalies tied to his ex-wife's signature. The word testimony hung in the air. She had talked. She had exposed everything. They placed him on immediate administrative leave, revoking all access and power. His entire empire vanished in a stack of papers. He hissed that Elena had manipulated them, that Adrian Cole was behind it all. But his CFO quietly cut him down. "She didn't," Grant said. "She just told the truth." And she found the courage for that truth in a difficult alliance. After the rawest of confrontations, she had asked Adrian, her voice cracking, "What do we do now?" He stood and met her gaze. "Now," he'd said, his own voice firm, "we bring Derek down completely, together, with no more secrets between us." But that trust was forged in fire. It began with a stunning confession Adrian made to her, admitting that at first, yes, he had planned to use her. He saw her as the key, the one person Derek allowed close enough to witness the truth, without ever realizing what she was seeing. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.